Excellent. Wel, hyfryd clywed y Barry Horns ac felly gael croesawu chi Expo'r Wal Goch, 4 diwrnod I ddathlu'r hyn sy'n dda a'r hyn o bosib sydd ddim cweit cystal mewn pêl-droed Cymreig. It's a great privilege to introduce Expo'r Wal Goch. The next 4 days we'll be looking at the good, the bad, and possibly the sometimes not so good about Welsh football. My name's Tim Hartley, and it's really good to be able to celebrate with you, looking forward to the Euros next week. It's been a busy time for Welsh football as we prepare to go back to play and to watch our teams. You know, we had the disappointment for Newport and for Wrexham and for Swansea. And then there's all the controversy over the Women's League as well. But there's good stuff too, isn't there? You know, we've got that friendly tomorrow, and some of us hopefully will make the trip over to Azerbaijan to cheer on the lads in the red wall. Now, when Russell Todd and I put together the Expo, we had 2 things on our mind, really. One was to offer a stage to explore Welsh football's social, cultural and political impact. And we wanted to bring people together to share their experiences and to build networks. And I think today's inaugural session, and with Martin Johns' particularly pertinent speech, we'll be doing that. I've got to do a little bit of thank you at the beginning here because we've had some great sponsors and supporters for the Expo. Thanks to Football Association of Wales, the FAW Trust, IndieQ, Sporting Heritage, Grow Social Capital, Gol Cymru, Llenyddiaeth Cymru, Literature Wales, and RTS Cymru Wales. Now, this is a Zoom meeting, and a lot of you will be familiar with it, but if you're not, if you could just keep your microphones on mute. We are recording this session, and we'll make all recordings available to you on a YouTube channel next week. So, you know, you can come back, and if you've missed something, you can watch and listen again. Please do use the chat facility. We'll be asking Martin some questions at the end of this session, and because there are so many of us on, I'll be trying to do that on our behalves. Mae 'na groeso I chi gyfrannu yn y Gymraeg. Gofynnwch y cwestiwn naill llai yn y chat, ac yna byddai'n gallu rhoi hwnna I Martin fel bod pawb yn deall y cwestiwn ar ateb. Please feel free to tweet. The hashtag we're using is EWG21. We're on Twitter at Expo Wal Goch, and there's also a Facebook page where you can comment. Draw felly dyn ni at Russell sy'n am gyflwyno Martin Jones ar gyfer y sesiwn agoriadol yma. Diolch.
Diolch, Tim. Warm welcome to Martin Johns, Professor Martin Johns. Most of you will be familiar with him, if not everybody. He's been seen on TV discussing Wales's relationship with England not so long ago, on S4C more recently discussing the 1919 race riots in Barry, Cardiff and Newport, and is on the first 2 episodes of the brand new current Football Nation programme that Ellis James is hosting. He's also written several books, both on Welsh history more generally, but also the history of sport in Wales, including the History of Sport in Wales, does what it says in the tin, 2005 publication, and Soccer and Society, South Wales 1900 to 39, that came out in 2002. He's got his own website, the W's martinjohns.com for more information. And just to reiterate, he's Professor of Modern History at Swansea University. So Martin's going to be sharing his screen with his slides. So if you're ready, Martin, we'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks. Can you see I shared it correctly? Excellent. Diolch am y croeso cynnes. Thanks from the warm welcome. What I'm going to do is, for the next kind of 45 minutes or so, is talk a little bit about how football was seen at the time rather than how we look back on the game now. If we think of the picture on the slide, the 1958 World Cup, the iconic moment in kind of Welsh football history, but at the time it simply didn't feel like that. It was the first World Cup that Wales had qualified for, but that had never really been a big deal before that. Wales had been invited to the 1930, 1934, the 1938 World Cups, and had turned down the invitations. You know, the World Cup simply wasn't that important to them then. Only one of the Welsh games was shown on British television in 1958 because of the complexities of kind of the technology of broadcasting. When one of the players got back from the tournament and arrived at Swansea Station, he recalls that the guard said to him, "Oh, been anywhere nice on your holidays?" not knowing that he'd actually been at the World Cup. So sometimes things seem very different in retrospect to they did at the time. And really, that's what I want to stress, really. And I want to bring out some kind of themes about why I think football matters to us here in Wales, but also more broadly, because maybe that fits in with, you know, the themes of this football festival, really. So just take you back a little bit to begin with to 1876, when the Football Association of Wales was formed, the third oldest association in the world. And again, it's another classic example of something becoming more important in retrospect. At the time, people certainly didn't feel that they were doing something historically important. It was formed following a letter in a London newspaper suggesting, well, Scots people play English people at sport, why don't we do the same? And a letter to a newspaper called The Field suggested that London Welshmen get together and form a team and challenge the English to a game. And he was really thinking about rugby, his letter suggested. But some people in Wrexham read this in a newspaper, thought this was a good idea, and set up the Football Association of Wales in order to basically play a game. It was only in retrospect that obviously evolved into what we know today. It wasn't some deliberate, conscious decision to promote Welshness in any political sense, or maybe even in a really sporting sense. But nonetheless, it grew into that. And the late Victorian period is a period when Wales was rediscovering its nationhood. It was looking back on its history and becoming interested in that. There was a kind of a re-evaluation that the Welsh language maybe mattered. And, you know, there is a national revival going on, and the football team became part of that. There was certainly no attempt at any kind of national purity. If you look at the first team, and you've got a table of who the first national team was, you can see it's a mix of different classes. But what that doesn't show you is that 5 of that first 11 were born in England. And indeed, one of them had really no connection with Wales at all, J.H. Edwards, who both lived and worked in Shrewsbury and had done his entire life, and indeed had already won an England cap at this stage. But he seems to have been picked entirely on the fact he was mates with Llywelyn Kenrick, who set up the Football Association of Wales. So there's no kind of great attempt to say this is what Wales means. But nonetheless, there was, in those early days, a celebration of how football brought different classes together. And I'll say more about that later on. But early on, really, we're talking about a game that exists in the northeast of Wales. In the south, it was rugby that was the sport. And again, we can explain this through the influence of local public schools. In North Wales, the big public school was in England, Shrewsbury School, and they played a version of football that involved dribbling the ball, what was then known as soccer. In the south, the big public schools played rugby, a version of the ball, a game that involved running with the ball. And really kind of it's the influence of those local elites on the regions around them that shape which sport took off. So Shrewsbury School is really responsible for why it was football rather than rugby that took off in the northeast of Wales, and in the south, it's the influence of schools like Llandovery and Trinity College in Carmarthen. And in these early days, football in Wales, football in the south is looked down upon in some ways. It's looked down upon as an English sport, because in the south, the people playing football tended to be people who had moved into South Wales to work in the coal industry or the iron industry. Between the 1870s and the First World War, about 200,000 people move into Glamorgan from England, 200,000 people. And many of them were coming from industrial parts of England where they already played and knew football. So they brought football with them. And indeed, when Newport County is set up in 1912, the reason why they choose to play in gold was that there were people living in the town who'd moved there from Wolverhampton to work in the iron industry. And there was a feeling, well, if we choose wolves as colours, we'll take off. But what this also means is that some people in the south look down upon football as an English sport. And not just an English sport, but a sport that was professional. Here's a quote from one newspaper in 1914. The association code in Wales is new and alien and comes in on the back of its popularity elsewhere. It's the game of the alien of the valleys, whose in-migration and denationalising tendency is one of the major problems of our country. And he contrasts it with rugby, a game which he feels is more Welsh and more democratic, because essentially what was happening was that some middle-class people refused to play football because it was a professional sport. And that would mean that the working classes had advantages over them. So whereas rugby was seen as kind of more bringing the classes together, in the South at least, rugby was seen as democratic, whereas football was just seen as a working class sport with very little middle class influence. But the key point here is most people didn't really care about this kind of thing. You've got newspapers talking about this kind of issues, but most people are just getting on with their lives. For them, sport and football was entertainment. It isn't about kind of symbolism. And it's a reminder here to us that we need to be careful about reading some of the symbols and some of the things that people say about sport too literally. So you do have middle-class people saying in the South saying football is English, it's working class sport, but most people just getting on with it. By the 20s and 30s, football does start to change its reputation in the South, and just as it was already in the North, it becomes seen as a symbol of Welshness. And really what matters here is success. In particular, Cardiff City they're one of the big British sides of the 1920s. They almost win the first division in 1924. They get to the FA Cup final in 25, and they win it in 27. Aberdeen and Merthyr are in the league as well. You know, South Wales is a hotbed of professional football, and some of these teams are doing well. And in that context, the middle classes who before the First World War had looked down upon football suddenly start to embrace it as a sign of Welshness. And when Cardiff win the FA Cup, both newspapers here and in England celebrate it as a Welsh event. And you can see those headlines. You know, it's not Cardiff versus Arsenal, it's England versus Wales. So success matters. And really, I think what this tells us is that in a nation without a currency, without its own law, without its own political representation, it's looking for symbolic recognition, and symbolic recognition which says something good about the nation. And football is jumped upon in the 1920s as a symbol of Welshness in a context where there wasn't much else going on that said something positive about Wales because of economic problems in that era. But it also becomes controversial again. Here's a letter to the Western Mail just after Cardiff had won the FA Cup. It's of course a matter of money. In soccer, if you have a rich city and a big gate, you can hire a fine team. But where's it going to end? A huge long-limbed Zulu whose arms span halfway between the posts for a goal. From China may come a couple of imperturbable, hard-working backs. From India, quick and cunning Gurkhas who could be brought in as halfbacks. And the forwards might be big, swift, versatile Maoris. Long may rugby football flourish, where we can take a personal interest in and enjoy a reflected glory of the prowess of our townsmen and fellow nationals, and tell the world with some show of truth that's the stuff we're made of. So while some people are celebrating football as a symbol of Welshness, other people are saying, but actually, if you look at the team, they're not Welsh at all, and they're not local. You know, in Cardiff's 27 winning team, only 3 of the team were Welsh and only 1 was from Cardiff. Sorry, only 2 were from Cardiff. But really, it's the last kind of sentences that give that away. Really, these are rugby fans worried about the future of their game, worried that football is taking off and taking away fans. And so many of the attacks on football as an English sport, as a sport that's debasing local culture, are really about rugby fans being defensive and worrying about the future of their game. But it has been something that's kind of come back as a point of discussion, you know, again and again, because, you know, occasions like the one on the right-hand side, Swansea fielding an all-Welsh side in 1959, they've simply been very rare. And these kind of incidents have created, I think, a degree of defensiveness in Welsh culture. Are we really quite as Welsh as the rugby players? Is there something that's not quite right in the culture of the game? And these contradictions are there, you know, all along, despite the fact that clubs like Swansea and Cardiff, you know, have used Welsh iconography and symbolism to attract people and to celebrate their Welshness throughout their history. You know, there's a couple of pictures there. of Swansea fans showing Welshness. There's always been those criticisms. Well, if you're really Welsh, why are you playing in England? There used to be the odd situation of English clubs playing in the Welsh Cup. Here's Hereford winning it in the early 90s. There's been the North-South divisions, which have, manifested themselves in lots of different ways. When the FAW moved their headquarters down to Cardiff in the 1970s, it caused considerable backlash in the North, and a feeling that the North has been marginalised once again, that the BBC, the Western Mail, all these big media institutions, they're only interested in the South. As from the 1970s onwards, there was a change in policy where basically the FAW started picking players on the basis of their ancestry rather than where they were born. In 1971, Trevor Hockey, who was brought up and born in Yorkshire but had a Welsh father, is selected for Wales, and he's the first so-called Englishman to be selected for Wales since before the First World War. And then you have, the whole contradictions of the anthems. God Save the Queen was the English anthem and the British anthem, and that meant the FAW played God Save the Queen before matches right up until 1977. In 1976, a game which, if you've seen Alice James's documentary, Phil Stead, who's written a great book about the history of Welsh football, in it he calls it the first nationalistic Welsh side, the 1976 Welsh national team. But it's worth remembering that before that game, both Hen Wlad fy Nada'i and God Save the Queen were playing. Two teams playing, three national anthems. So there are plenty of kind of contradictions around this, and it is a reminder to us that what constitutes Welsh identity, what it means to be Welsh, has always been debated and contested. For some people, purity matters, whatever that means. For other people, it's just about the symbolism. For some people, Swansea playing in the English League is a way of showing the English we exist. It's a way of taking pride in Welshness. For other people, it's letting down their country. Cymraeg, the Welsh language, did have a place in this football culture, but only gradually. If you look before the First World War, certainly in the northwest of Wales, you've got Welsh clubs playing and being run through the medium of Welsh. But because the Welsh language was so associated with chapel culture, there's also, in much of the kind of the Welsh language literature, a looking down upon football, sarcastic poems like the one you've got there, kick your pêl-droed, kind of almost saying, what's wrong with the Welsh people? They're obsessed by football and kicking balls. They should be obsessed by God and religion. So certainly in the early days, although there are people playing and running clubs through the media of Welsh, Welsh print culture is often very dismissive of football. If you like kind of linguistics, the word pêl-droed goes back to the 16th century. But actually, when you look at newspaper reports in North Wales of football in the 1890s, they're always calling it football, spelled FFWTBOL. And it's only kind of maybe in more recent years that pêl-droed has become more established as the name. Not until 1953 that the rules of football are translated into Welsh. And it's only really very recently that the FAW has embraced bilingualism. If you go back to the 1976 Wales-Yugoslavia match that I mentioned before, which for the fans was a very nationalistic event. I was flicking through the programme a couple of days ago. The only Welsh words that appear in it, apart from Hen Wlad fy Nada'i, is the word croeso. The word Cymru doesn't appear anywhere in the programme. So embracing the Welsh language has been a slow part of Welsh football culture, even though in the north, at least, there have certainly been clubs and fandom and fans living their entire lives through the medium of Welsh. It's maybe not a pleasant reminder for according to your politics, but I think one of the things that football reminds us is that Welsh culture has also been very British. You saw that in the FAW. As I said, the World Cup, Wales was invited to all three World Cups in the 1930s, and FIFA was desperate for Wales to be there because Wales was British and Britain was the home of the game. Wales are offered a place in the World Cup and they can skip qualifying. And indeed, in 1938, Wales has such a good domestic team, they might have actually won the World Cup if they turned up. But they don't want to turn up because if it's not good enough for England, it's not good enough for Wales. The determination to play God Save the Queen can be seen as another example of that, but you see it in the fans as well. In 1927, when Cardiff play at Wembley, thousands of fans went to visit the National Cenotaph to remember their comrades, their friends, their family who'd fallen in the First World War a decade before. The King meets the team, and the King is so impressed, according to the press, with the Welsh singing that he asks Hyn Wlad fy Nadain to be played for a second time, because he so loves the Welsh singing. And this story is repeated in the Welsh press again and again, because it's the King being proud and impressed by Wales. So, you know, football reminds us of kind of people's sense of Britishness, and that carries on much later. When the 1966 World Cup is held, it's the first tournament, not just in England, but in Wales as well, that is really followed in the Welsh press. After England win it, the Western Mail, in an editorial, say, this isn't just an English victory, this belongs to the whole of Britain. This is a product of British football culture. This cartoon appears in the South Wales Echo just before the World Cup final as well. I never thought football would interest women until feminine tactics entered the game. And at one level, this is kind of taking the mickey out of, you know, players kind of hugging and things. It's also a kind of a symbol of how masculine football was often seen. But it's also noticeable that a Welsh newspaper didn't find any problem with putting on its front page a cartoon that said "Bravo England" and showing Cardiffians supporting England. It was a sunny summer day, the World Cup final, and across Wales from north to south, shows, carnivals, local community events all noted how badly attended they were, because people stayed at home to support England in the World Cup final. It also happens 2 weeks after Gwynfor Evans becomes the first Plaid Cymru MP, an event which created quite a backlash in Wales. It's ironic that the English press are celebrating this because they see it as the little man standing up for his rights against the big British state. And the right-wing press in particular in England was very supportive of Plaid Cymru, feeling that it was sticking two fingers up at the Labour government. But in Wales, the press was worried about what this meant. And what's interesting is in the Welsh language press after England win the World Cup, you say, this is just like us. We just wanted to defend our nation and to celebrate our nation. And that's what's happening with, you know, with all the fuss about England winning the World Cup. And it just shows you can have a friendly kind of patriotism. So the Welsh language press picks up on England winning the World Cup as a way of saying nationalism really isn't that bad and we don't need to be afraid of it here in Wales. Now, it's inconceivable today that a Welsh paper would stick a cartoon that says "Bravo England" on the front page. You know, Welsh not British is a common refrain, a common logo, you know, amongst hardcore Welsh fans. And really, I think what's happened is that, you know, there's been football reminds us that our attitudes to Britishness have split in a way that simply wasn't the case 20 years ago, really, let alone 50 years ago. About a fifth of people, pretty much every social survey is consistent in showing, say they're not British. But that means that the other 4/5 of the Welsh population are okay embracing some kind of Britishness. And, you know, it's a reminder that, you know, while there is a very hardcore Welsh not British component to Welsh identity and Welsh society, it's not the majority. But why football, I think, has been so successful as a symbol of Welshness is there's no right or wrong way of being Welsh. You can stand in a Wal Goch, you can be part of the red wall, you know, behind the goal at Cardiff City Stadium. And for you, you might be, you know, football might be a symbol of kind of your sense of independence and your political nationalism. For other people, they're just having a laugh and enjoying supporting Wales. It doesn't matter what Welshness means to you. You can just support the team. It takes this abstract concept of nationhood, and you know, and Welshness is very abstract in so many ways because we're not a nation state, and it brings it alive. And why football has been so successful, I think, as a symbol of Welshness is it makes no demands on us. You just can be Welsh regardless of your class, your colour, what language you speak, your politics. You can just support the team. But where I think football also reminds us is we should never forget class. You know, understanding Wales means understanding class as much as understanding national identity. You know, here's a reminder which the Cambrian, a big Swansea newspaper, published just when Swansea town was formed in 1912. And in it, you see why class matters in Welsh society. It's talking down to the players who, of course, would have been working class. Don't lose your temper. Don't play the gallery. You know, it's you know, this is some patronizing journalist. But it's also patronizing to the spectators. Don't think your team is the only one that can play a clever game. There are others. Don't desert your team when they strike a bad match. That's when they need your encouragement. Don't blame the referee for your defeats. Take them as men. Don't go to see one team play. It takes two sides to provide your sport. Give them both a share of your cheering. And this is middle class condescension that the working class can't be relied upon to be sporting about the whole thing. That they're prejudiced. That they only think about themselves. They only think about their team. You know, and this is a product of class attitudes at a time when the Labour Party is growing, when working class political power is starting to challenge the establishment for the first time. You can't trust the working classes to be balanced about things. They'll only think about themselves. And in this case, they'll only think about their team. But it also reminds it that football was sometimes very expensive. It has this reputation as the working class game. But actually, in this era, it would have cost sixpence to go to a match. You could have bought 3 or 4 pints for that. Between the wars, the minimum price of getting into a game is £1. You could have gone to the cinema 3 times for that. Football was expensive. It was beyond the reach of maybe a third of the working class, those living on the breadline. And here you do see one reminder of that to directors. Don't be too hasty in putting up prices. It often cuts down the average attendance. Football cost money, and it's a reminder and how angry people got in this era, especially in the 1920s and the 1930s, about not being able to afford to go to matches. Football reminds us about social exclusion. Sometimes it crossed class divisions, and sometimes it's really celebrated for bringing the different classes together. I won't read this out, but it's a long description of the Cardiff City crowd in 1922. Playing Spurs, their first game in the first division. And literally it goes through different sections of the Welsh population, pointing out they're all here. Workmen, women, clerks, there's a vicar there, soldiers, college students. And it's stressing towards the end, amidst all this stood the policeman, busy and wonderfully disinterested. And what you find is that although football is celebrated for bringing the classes together, there's nearly always a political purpose to that. In the 1920s, the Russian Revolution is just a handful of years behind. 1924, the election of the first Labour government. People are worried about revolution. They're worried about the future of society. And football is reassuring to them because they can see different segments of the population coming together, supporting a game. So football goes from being looked down upon as a working class sport to being celebrated for bringing people together. And at one level, there is a lot of truth in this. You know, it did bring people together, but whether that had political consequences, whether people forgot about the inequalities of a class-based society, it is unlikely. These are temporary moments of social unity. But just to illustrate again how obsessed the press is by making this point, this is the front page of the Western Mail after Cardiff win the FA Cup. And it's a cartoon which on the surface says, we're all happy Cardiff have won the cup. But when you look at who's in the picture, it seems to be every member of Welsh society. You know, there's a posh businessman in his bowler hat, 2 ordinary blokes, a young working class lad in his hat, a guy who may, I don't know, maybe he's meant to represent a Scottish migrant, the trendy, young, fashionable women. And look, even the cat and the dog are playing with each other, saying we've won the cup. It's a message of social unity in a context where Wales didn't feel socially unified at all as political tensions ranked up. But sometimes, there is a genuine social inclusion that's going on here. The main picture there is a guy called Eddie Paris, born in a village, Pwllmeurig, just outside Newport, just outside Chepstow in 1911. And in at the beginning of the 1930s, he becomes the first black man to play for Wales. England don't cap a black player until 1978. Not a big deal is made out of this. The press don't celebrate it as a symbol of kind of racial inclusion or anything, but nonetheless, it happened. In the same era, in the 1930s, there's a team called the Cardiff All Blacks, which were made up of migrant workers living in the Cardiff Bay area. Here's an advert for them playing an exhibition match in Cheltenham, a team of clever coloured colonials well known throughout Wales, playing their first visit on an English ground. And in a world which was overtly racist, being able to come together to represent your country, to play on a pitch in front of the crowd, these things were moments of social inclusion. And the same was true for women as well. In the First World War, women's football becomes very popular, not because there's some great desire to kind of help women, but there were worries that you had young women working in factories. They had too much money. And if they had too much money, what were they going to spend it on? Maybe go to the pub. There were worries about their sexual behavior, that their young men were going to go off to France and the girls would get up to all kinds before their men went. So football was seen as a way of distracting young women from pubs and sex, basically. So it's encouraged across Britain. The number of women going to matches increases in the 1920s and 30s. Here's an extract from the Cardiff City programme in 1938. Men are not the one and only critic of our national game. The ladies who attend in large numbers are well versed in the finer points of soccer, and we raise our hats in sincere acknowledgement of their fervour. Ladies present, we must stick to parliamentary language in watching the game. Afterwards, we all feel the better for the curb. At one level, it's patronising, it's taking the mickey out of them, making a joke that they might swear. But at another level, it is a reminder that women were part of the game, and in a sexually stratified society, it was empowering for them. But football could never overcome just how deeply divided society was. Eddie Parris only ever won one cap. Was that because of his colour? Quite possibly. Cardiff All Blacks may have been constantly referred to as popular in the Welsh press, but they never entered the Cardiff local league. They only ever played charity exhibition games. And was that because that protected them from racism on and off the pitch? Quite probably, I would think. In 1921, the FAW bans women's teams from playing on pitches under its jurisdiction. It was following the FA in that line. Again, another reminder of how the FAW simply tended to follow whatever the FA did. But it was also because women playing football was incredibly controversial. Yes, there were big crowds watching them, but there were often big crowds watching them because it seemed to be unusual. They were going there to see the spectacle. And in different Welsh newspapers, at this time when Welsh women's football is at its height in 1920, there are so many letters like this one to the South Wales Echo saying, what's this about? This doesn't seem right. And this is from someone called Vera. In my opinion, there are plenty of pastimes for girls without indulging in such masculine games as football. And I don't think any really nice girls would play it. And it goes on. So at an individual level, playing sport was empowering. It was social inclusion, but at a structural level, it never overcame the racism or the sexism of society. And football remained very white and very male, and, the terraces, which we're all, or certainly men of my generation, are very nostalgic about. Everything that seemed great about them in some level at the time was also why they were terrible. They were very male and very aggressive. And, while it was fun to be part of them for some people, there's a Swansea crowd from the early 90s. But at another level, it was the atmosphere that kept people away. And what draws some people to the game is what's turned other people off the game. That's the key point there. Football is also about community, and we should never forget that. And that's probably kind of one of the key messages that will come out of the next few days. Football clubs are rooted in their communities. They're reminders that community matters to people. I think civic society, our politics today, hasn't been good enough at taking advantage of that. And football reminds people care about where they're from and will make efforts and will make sacrifices for where they're from. Football grounds were part of the civic landscape, you know, they're there in the middle of towns. And, you know, they used to say in Swansea, you know, it didn't matter where you lived in Swansea, you could hear the noise from the vetch scrape, you know, moving across the city. You know, they were reminders of what it meant to be from a place. And that was true of the smallest clubs to the biggest clubs. There's a forgotten book by a guy called Ronald Frankenberg, which was written in the 1950s. He was an academic at, I think it was Manchester University, and he wants to study working class life. And he goes and lives in a tiny mining village near the border in northeast Wales. And he finds they're obsessed by football there. And he finds that people are making huge sacrifices to keep the football club going. And women in particular, you know, they're keeping the books, they're doing the washing, they're making the sandwiches. And he says lots of people who are involved in this football club don't care about football, but they care about their village. They care about their community. And being part of this, helping the team, is about helping your community. And there's something there. If we can take advantage of that, we can create a social good, I think, out of football. Yes, there are arguments. You know, he gets dragged in to judge, for example, the fancy dress parade, because they can't trust anyone local to do it because they'll just favour their family. There are arguments over whether it's right to get a good centre forward from the next village. Oh, he'll help the team, but then he's not a local boy. You know, there are always debates around these things, but community matters. And that means when football goes wrong, we lose more than just a club. The depression of the 20s and the 30s was devastating for football in lots of different ways. You know, Merthyr Town, in their last season in the Football League, are getting gates of around 400, but thousands are turning out to watch them train. When the club finally goes bankrupt in 1934, you know, the editorial of the newspaper says, you know, we've lost more than a football club. The demise of the club is a real loss to the town in more senses than one. We can ill afford to part with any sport or attraction which provides us healthy entertainment for our young people and our interest for adults. Too many who find their enforced leisure a burden. In a town suffering 60% unemployment, in a town that felt forgotten by government, in a town that had seen its economy literally collapse, the loss of a football club was another symbol of that, but a symbol that meant people had lost one of the few things that kept them going, one of the sparks of life in their town, one of the things that put their town on the map. So, you know, this is part of our heritage. Whether you like football enough or not, these clubs are something to cherish, because they have meant so much to so many people. They've defined who these towns are. How many people in Britain in the 1930s would have known anything about Merthyr if they hadn't had a football club? But football also matters, I think, and at a different level. And it's a reminder about society is made up of individuals. I'm not saying society doesn't exist, but we are all individuals. And one of the things why football matters so much to us is the way it connects us to other people. It's about relationships. It's about our relationships with people we don't know, the people you see standing near you or sitting near you because they're there every week, the feeling part of being part of a crowd, but also the people you do know. And kind of football is part of personal heritage as well as collective heritage. It's something we pass on to our children. It's something that connects us to a past. Here's a project Swansea City Supporters Trust ran in 2012 to celebrate the club's centenary, and people were asked to kind of fill in a questionnaire about their memories. And this is kind of one of my favorite responses. My dad was a big supporter like myself. He died in 2011 before he could have a smile about us being in the Premiership. I remember crying at Wembley after we'd beaten Reading 4-2 because the only person I wanted to share my elation with was my dad, and he wasn't here anymore. He left me a mint copy of Swansea versus Preston at Villa Park, semi-final of the FA Cup 1964. It seems apt that Swansea's first Prem away win was at Villa Park, and I was there. I looked up to the sky and just smiled. I think my dad knew why. So the way football connects us to other people, people we don't know, our family, our children, our grandkids, our sense of being part of a city, a town, a village, Wales, a global community of football fans. Those things matter. Overcoming socialization is really important. Developing a collective sense of endeavor, working together to create a better society. You know, in some ways we failed at that, but football reminds us that these things matter. There is something there that we can tap to create a better world. I don't want to romanticize football too much. We've all been to crap games. In 1991, there was a friendly at the Arms Park. There was just 3,656 people there. In a stadium, what was the Arms Park, 55,000 or something? Watching Wales sometimes was terrible. My team, Swansea, watching Swansea was sometimes terrible. I get very nostalgic about what the old North Bank and the Vetch Fields were like, but it was crap sometimes. And we forget that. And football is entertainment, and we shouldn't ever forget that. Here's a letter to the South Wales Echo after the 1966 World Cup. People will always pay for real skill, and after witnessing the World Cup games, it does bring home to everyone the poor kick and rush stuff we've been served up with Ninian Park in recent years. For all the good things, there are bad things there as well. But football is never just about what happens on the pitch. When it does go right on the pitch, it's beautiful. You know, I'm sure we all kind of get we'll be talking about Euro 2016 for the rest of our lives. But things like that, you know, they're not unique. Here's a great, you know, here's two sources from 1938, which kind of remind us maybe what football can be. When your team beats England, when you have a great win with some fantastic play. Goal number 4 sent the crowd crazy. Bryn Jones started it with a wide sweeping pass to Cumnor. Cumnor beats Broston before turning the ball inwards to Astley. This brilliant centre forward still had to beat Young, but he swept past him as if he did not exist. Woodley scenting danger came out, but Astley, cool and calculating, placed the ball past the advancing goalkeeper like a master. That team could have been at the 38 World Cup if the FAW had had more imagination. Here's a poem from 1938, written by Idris Davis, who was a Welsh miner turned poet. The Saturday afternoon specially made for Cardiff City, the avalanche of hands and feet to Ninian Park, the clamour and the roar, disputed goal, play up the blues, the brass band at half-time, abide with me and Sosvan Fach, the pigeons released and sweeping north and east and west, the beer bottles waving, the mascot vendors, and then the returning crowd, the great horse crowd, surging back to city streets for ale and chops and tarts. And in the winter evening, Tiger Bay was Tiger Bay, and the moon rose over the Severn Sea. A good night out, being part of a crowd, seeing a great game, you know, that's why football has meant so much to so many people. So to bring all of this together in a very whistle-tops tour, football, it's been totally shaped by wider social, cultural and economic forces, whether that's immigration from England, establishing the game in the south, whether it's the influence of public schools in the north, leading to the establishment of the FAW, whether it's the effect of the economy, whether it's how we think about our communities and our sense of national identity. Football is shaped by the world it exists in, unsurprisingly. But it's also providing an escape from that, a moment when we forget our troubles, a moment when we can take some pride in who we are, take some pride in our community and our nations. You know, it's offered compensation for worlds that often haven't been very kind to Welsh communities. It's been a really important source of Welsh identity. It's been flexible. It's allowed people to feel Welsh without making any demands on what that means. Sometimes maybe it's been too important. Maybe because football has offered us as an escape, we've been too complacent, too willing to accept the inequalities that are so obvious in society. Maybe, you know, we haven't pushed for kind of greater political recognition and devolution that might have allowed us to create a fairer society, because we've been happy enough to use sport to give us our sense of Welshness. At its best, football can be fun. At its worst, it can be boring. At its best, it brings us together. At its worst, it excludes people. And what we need to do, I think, in society, and why events like this are really important, is it's about harnessing the power of football to bring people together. but not doing that in a way that straitjackets them, that forces them to be Welsh in a certain way, forces people into boxes, allows people to be themselves, allows people to come together and to harness what people already feel, that other people matter. And if we can use football in that way, we can create a better world. And, you know, that matters far more than who wins a playoff on a Saturday, although I'm still gutted about Swansea. Diolch yn fawr, thank you. You're on mute, Tim.
Martin, thanks very much for that. I mean, it's brilliant to go through our history once again. And I love that business about the 1938 World Cup, you know, if only we'd gone there, if only we'd gone there. But there we have it. And also the women's games, great to see the FAW making such strides in getting participation up with a women's game. And of course, you go back 70 years and they were literally banning them. We've had a couple of questions here for you. Kerry is asking, can you tell him a little bit more about what he calls the English or the Marches towns who are playing? I remember them in the Welsh Cup, but I mean, how much of that cross-border stuff was going on?
Loads. I mean, the border, it wasn't even always obvious where the border was, you know, in this era, and it had no, you know, it had no political significance except for when the pubs were shut on a Sunday, essentially. The linguistic border was far more important, and you know, there were Welsh-speaking people and communities even on the English side of the border, and there were people on the Welsh side of the border who just didn't regard themselves as Welsh at all. So it had always been a fairly kind of flexible thing. Oswestry, literally a town in England, in many ways was seen as a Welsh town, and the FAW had no problem in those early days of picking players who'd been born in Oswestry. In the early days, travel is expensive. You know, and Hereford and Shrewsbury are near mid Wales. You know, they're near Cardiff. They're not that far from Swansea. So for them, it made sense, you know, to take part in Welsh competitions, and also having Welsh clubs in English competitions added a national flavour to things. So when you were playing Hereford, you weren't just playing a big team in the Welsh Cup. You were playing an English team, and that helped bring in fans. So just as the English authorities were quite happy to have Welsh teams as part of them, the FAW was happy to have these kind of marcher towns, these border towns, taking part in Welsh competitions as well. You know, it all comes to an end really in the 1990s, in an era when Wales was worried about its future as an independent football nation. You know, when there were genuine discussions, you know, not at an official level, but in the corridors about, well, why Britain got 4 teams? This doesn't seem right. And, you know, the foundation of what then was the League of Wales, you know, was a defensive maneuver to say, you know, we are a nation, we have our own league competition. And, you know, moving the English clubs out of the Welsh competitions was part of that. There was always the danger of what it might mean for Swansea, Cardiff, etc. But, you know, Alan Evans gets got a lot of hassle over lots of things, especially to do with the employment of Terry Yorth, or the non-employment of Terry Yorth. But Welsh football owes him a debt of gratitude for how he stood up for Wales and the FAW in the early 90s, and pushed forward the Welsh League, and ensured that, you know, Wales still exists as a football nation, because it was created as a historical accident and there's no guarantee it will last.
Yeah, I think that's really important when we look at the Team GB issue, which maybe we should have had a session on. And, you know, 1 or 2 players from Wales being eligible for that, and a threat that could threat to our independence as a footballing nation. And I know you've written on that. Just another question from Carwyn here. He's interested in women's football in World War II, read a lot about it being big in England. How big was it in Wales?
It's played. It's certainly played. I mean, normal rules get kind of pushed aside in wartime, and just as in the First World War, you know, women started to play without without their femininity being compromised. The same is true. The same is true in the Second World War. So it does grow. It does take place at grounds under the FAW jurisdiction. The FAW never always quite stuck to its ban, but it doesn't get huge amounts of media attention in either Wales or England. But it is played in a very kind of, there aren't big formal clubs or anything, but there are lots of games taking place a lot across Wales, just as there had been in the First World War, but just without any of the attention, because it just didn't seem so new as it had done in the First World War.
We've got one more question from Ryan from Alternative Wales. He's asking, how do you think, it's a bit of future thinking now, how do you think that this team from 2016 in France to present day, how will it be looked at in 50 to 100 years' time? Because things have changed. We've sort of reached a maturity. What are your views on that?
It's all according to what happens next. If we win the World Cup twice in the 2030s, 2016 won't seem that important. If we don't ever achieve anything ever again, 2016 will be the high point. It's like 1958. It matters in retrospect in a way that it didn't matter at the time. We're not going to win the World Cup, are we, twice in the next couple of decades? But it's a great team, and it's very difficult, isn't it, comparing eras because the game is so different. But yeah, I think I'll be surprised if a team as good as the 2016 team came along, because it wasn't just about some fantastic players like Bale and Ramsey and Allen, who were genuinely world class. It was about a team that played together. And of course, history is also, what gets remembered is also about what people write about. And, so many of us got so excited and so romantic about the whole thing, and the whole experience of France was so great. And, and Johnny Owen's, great film about it. All of those things will help decide how it's remembered. So so what people say at the time does have some influence on how it's remembered. But ultimately, football is always about, history is always about the present. So it's all about what happens next that will really decide how this team is remembered. But I hope they're remembered properly, because they were genuinely one of the best Welsh sides ever, I would think.
Just another quick question here. Billy Meredith, how significant was he? One of Wales's, first superstars, really. And what did he give us that maybe we don't, in the present day know about?
I mean, Billy Meredith was the first football superstar. Not just Welsh, but anywhere in many ways. He was famous. He was iconic. He was kind of a music hall star. He played for two of the big clubs, Manchester City and Manchester United. Being Welsh wasn't part of that kind of equation in England. It wasn't important in what made him a superstar. It was his talent more than anything. And Wales in some ways wakes up, I think, to him a little bit late. So it starts to see, wow, God, this guy's getting real respect in England. And, Wales always jumps on anything which kind of makes Wales feel good about itself. And I think it's really only in the 1920s does Welsh culture and the Welsh media really start to celebrate Billy Meredith. But in many ways, I think what's most significant about Billy Meredith was he stood up for players' rights at a time when there was a maximum wage, and worse than a maximum wage, there was a contract system that basically tied you to a club. And if your club didn't want to renew your contract, you couldn't move to another club unless they paid you a transfer fee. They retained your registration even if they weren't paying you. And that didn't end until kind of 1960. But Billy Meredith was an early advocate for players' rights, helped set up the Players' Union, and was a really important part of a discussion that took a long time, that football was exploiting his players. He matters to the football industry. He did eventually become a symbol of Welshness, and he was a famous figure that helped popularize football across Britain. So, he is really important. What kind of player he was, everyone said he was great, but there's actually no way of really knowing because the footage just doesn't exist. But certainly everyone at the time said he was the wizard of dribble.
Yeah, Leon's just said there should be a Billy Meredith statue in Chirk. That's something to campaign for. Martin, thank you so much. Many issues there, and you've set up the week nicely for us. You've given us the historical context, but also raised a lot of questions: the women's game, professionalism, where we see ourselves in terms of Wales as an independent football nation, and what does that say about us politically. Thank you very much. I'm handing over now to Russell to preview our next session and the rest of the week. Russell.
Diolch, Tim. Yeah, Martin, it was amazing. Really, really grateful for your time and the effort put into that. Just on the subject, I'll do this in reverse. Mess up the scheduling. On Friday morning, we're doing a session about Lee Richmond Roos, who was one of Billy Meredith's contemporaries. He stayed as an amateur, so he probably didn't have any of those problems with registrations because he managed to negotiate quite healthy expenses with the clubs he played for. We're hearing from Spencer Vignes, who wrote a very posthumous, obviously, biography of Lee Roos. We're hearing about him on Friday morning, 9:30, but more urgently and imminently, we've got Dr. Penny Miles from Bath University with us at 2 o'clock. Similar sort of format. We'll be hearing from her about some of her research into aspects of gender in football, not just in Wales. She's a bit of an expert on politics and culture in South America, in Latin America. So she's done some work on Chile as well. But she's imported some of that into all that background and that expertise into the Welsh game and the Welsh scene. So Penny's coming up at 2, and I think we've got Dave. I think we've got Ryan March, Dave Collins as well. They're joining us this evening at 7 o'clock about fanzines. Clwch, read all about it. It's the tradition of the fanzine. It's chaired by Steve Davis, who was a London Welshman, founded one of the Spurs fanzines, Cock-a-Doodle-Doos, contributed to any number of others, has written several times for When Saturday Comes. If anybody subscribes to that, they may well be familiar with Steve. He's going to chair that session for us, and we're very grateful for Steve's time this evening. So that's 7 o'clock. And you should all have the codes. If there's any problems, then get in touch with us. Email's probably the best one, best way of doing that. And then tomorrow we go again, Tim, and I'll have to just remind myself what we've got because there's tons on this week. Yeah, we're hearing about club ownership, and we heard from Martin just then about the role of clubs. Really quite telling, the coverage in Merthyr, Martin, about the demise of that club in the local press and the impact and what that meant, even then. I don't know why I said even. Why should it be any different then than now? But what is community ownership and how does one take control of one's own club is the subject of tomorrow's first session, which is at 12:30, so not 12 o'clock, 12:30. And that's been chaired by Andy Walsh from the Football Supporters Association, and who was one of the founding directors of FC United of Manchester. So he's talking about it both from the perspective of a governing body, not a governing body, but like an infrastructure national body, but also having got some dirt under his fingernails in the fan ownership boardroom as well. Tim, anything else?
No, I think that's it. Just like to thank everyone who's attended for your comments and that. Do keep tweeting. Look for us on Facebook. Spread the word, because I think it's great that everybody's, getting to have their say on this. And once again, thank you very much to Martin for such a fantastic opening to the Expo.